I never imagined that the most peaceful place in my world would become the center of the most devastating betrayal I would ever experience. The house by the lake had been my sanctuary since childhood, a place where my grandfather Jenkins and I spent countless summer afternoons fishing, talking about life, and watching the sun set over the water. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left me that house, along with all the memories that made it sacred to me. My name is Lily, and at 34, I thought I had built a life worth living. As a successful graphic designer, I had established my own small studio and enjoyed the creative freedom that came with being my own boss. The lake house had been my weekend retreat, my inspiration, and my connection to the grandfather who raised me after my parents died when I was 12. Those walls held every important conversation of my adolescence, every dream I had shared with the man who believed in me when no one else did. Everything changed when I married Ethan 3 years ago. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to understand my attachment to the house. During our courtship, he would join me on weekend trips to the lake, helping with small repairs and listening patiently as I shared stories about my grandfather. His enthusiasm felt genuine, and I believed I had found someone who valued the same things I did. The first cracks in our marriage appeared after Ethan's father died 18 months ago. The grief changed him, or perhaps it revealed who he really was. His mother, Vivian, who had always been politely distant, suddenly became a constant presence in our lives. She would call daily, drop by unannounced, and insert herself into every decision we made as a couple. At first, I attributed her behavior to grief and tried to be understanding. I had lost my own parents and grandparents, after all. I knew how devastating loss could be. But Vivian's grief manifested differently than mine had. Where I had learned to cherish memories and hold on to meaningful connections, she seemed determined to take control of everything around her. She criticized our apartment, suggesting it was too small for a growing family, though Ethan and I had never discussed having children. She questioned my career choices, wondering aloud why I insisted on working when Ethan made enough to support us both. Most troubling of all, she began making comments about the lake house. "It's such a burden for a young couple," she would say, shaking her head sadly. "All that maintenance, the property taxes, the isolation. Wouldn't it be wiser to sell and invest the money in something more practical?" Initially, Ethan would deflect these conversations, changing the subject or gently defending my attachment to the property. But as months passed, I noticed his responses growing less enthusiastic. He stopped joining me for weekend trips to the lake, claiming work obligations or exhaustion. When I went alone, he would make comments about wasted time and missed opportunities to focus on our future together. The shift was so gradual that I almost didn't notice it happening. Ethan began echoing his mother's concerns about finances, even though our combined income was more than sufficient for our needs. He started questioning expenses related to the house, from routine maintenance to the property insurance. When I pointed out that the house was paid off and actually saved us money on vacation costs, he would nod absently and change the subject. My friend Chloe was the first to voice what I was beginning to suspect, but couldn't bring myself to acknowledge. We were having coffee one afternoon when she asked directly about Vivian's increased involvement in my marriage. "Lily, I've watched you become smaller every time that woman is around," she said, stirring her latte with unusual intensity. "And Ethan just sits there while she undermines you. When did you start needing permission to spend your own money on your own property?" Her words stung because they rang with truth. I had begun asking Ethan's opinion before making any decisions about the house, something I had never done before our marriage. I had started second-guessing my own instincts about repairs and improvements, seeking his approval for expenses that were entirely within my means. Somehow, I had allowed my confidence to erode under the constant questioning and subtle criticism. The situation became more complex when I began experiencing health problems. It started with joint pain and fatigue that I initially attributed to stress and long hours at my computer. But when a persistent rash appeared across my cheeks and the fatigue became debilitating, I finally sought medical attention. After weeks of tests and consultations, my doctor delivered a diagnosis that changed everything: systemic lupus erythematosus. The autoimmune condition explained my symptoms and provided a treatment plan, but it also gave Vivian new ammunition for her campaign against the lake house. She immediately positioned herself as the concerned mother-in-law, full of suggestions about how I should modify my lifestyle to accommodate my illness. "You need to reduce stress, dear," she would say with manufactured concern. "Managing that old house from the city must be exhausting. And what if you have a flare-up while you're there alone? It's so isolated, so far from proper medical care." Her arguments seemed reasonable on the surface, which made them harder to refute. She wasn't wrong that managing the property required effort, or that my autoimmune condition would present ongoing challenges. But her solutions always pointed in the same direction: sell the house, simplify my life, let her son take care of me. Ethan's response to my diagnosis was more troubling than Vivian's manipulation. While she maintained a facade of concern, he seemed almost relieved to have a concrete reason to revisit the question of the lake house. He began having whispered phone conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. He spent increasing amounts of time at his mother's apartment, always returning with new concerns about my health and our financial future. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I overheard a conversation between Ethan and someone I didn't recognize at a coffee shop near my doctor's office. I had finished my appointment early and decided to grab lunch before heading back to the studio. As I waited in line, I heard Ethan's voice from a corner table and automatically looked in his direction. He was seated across from a well-dressed man with graying hair, and their conversation was intense and focused. "The property is prime lakefront," the stranger was saying. "Even in this market, we're looking at 7 figures easily. Maybe more if we time it right." Ethan nodded, consulting something on his phone. "She's attached to it for sentimental reasons, but with the medical expenses and everything else, she'll have to be practical eventually. These old family properties are always emotional," the man replied with practiced sympathy. "But your wife will thank you when she sees how much stress this removes from her life. Chronic illness is expensive and liquidity gives you options." I left the coffee shop without ordering, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. The stranger had to be a real estate agent, and they were discussing my house as if the decision to sell had already been made. The casual way Ethan had referred to my attachment as merely sentimental, the assumption that I would eventually see reason, the complete absence of any consideration for my feelings made me feel sick in a way that had nothing to do with lupus. That evening, I confronted Ethan directly. I told him what I had overheard and asked for an explanation. His response revealed the depth of the deception I had been living with. He didn't deny the conversation or apologize for going behind my back. Instead, he became defensive and condescending, explaining that he was trying to protect me from having to make such a difficult decision while dealing with my illness. "You're not thinking clearly, Lily," he said with the patient tone one might use with a confused child. "The stress of maintaining that place is making your condition worse. I've been trying to find a solution that works for everyone." "A solution that works for everyone, or a solution that works for you and your mother?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. His expression hardened. "My mother cares about your well-being. We both do. If you can't see that, maybe your judgment is more compromised than I thought." The conversation escalated from there, with Ethan eventually storming out to spend the night at Vivian's apartment. I spent the rest of the evening in stunned silence, trying to process the reality that my husband and mother-in-law had been plotting to manipulate me into selling the most important thing I owned. The next morning, I called Arthur Hayes, the family lawyer who had handled my grandfather's estate. Arthur had been Grandpa Jenkins' friend for over 40 years, and I trusted him completely. I explained the situation and asked him to review the will and property documents to ensure my ownership was secure. Arthur's response provided both reassurance and additional concern. "Your grandfather was a wise man, Lily," he said during our meeting the following day. "He included specific clauses in his will to protect that property from exactly this kind of pressure. No one can force you to sell, and any attempt to do so through coercion or manipulation could have serious legal consequences." He paused, studying the documents more carefully. "However, I want to review any power of attorney documents you may have signed, especially anything related to medical decisions. People sometimes use health crises to gain control over assets." His words sent a chill through me. I remembered Vivian's recent insistence that Ethan and I update our estate planning documents, something she had framed as prudent preparation for my ongoing health challenges. She had even recommended a lawyer, someone she described as more modern and efficient than Arthur. We had an appointment scheduled for the following week. I canceled that appointment immediately and asked Arthur to prepare limited medical power of attorney documents that would protect my interests while still allowing Ethan to make emergency medical decisions if necessary. I also asked him to review any documents I had already signed to ensure they couldn't be misused. Meanwhile, my relationship with Ethan continued to deteriorate. He maintained that he was acting in my best interests, but his behavior suggested otherwise. He seemed angry that I had consulted Arthur, accusing me of being secretive and suspicious. He spent more time at his mother's apartment and less time engaging with me about anything substantive. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, when my rheumatologist recommended a minor surgical procedure to address complications from my lupus. The surgery was routine, but it would require general anesthesia and a brief hospital stay. Ethan and Vivian immediately positioned themselves as my primary support system, insisting that I shouldn't worry about anything except my recovery. The night before the surgery, I couldn't sleep. My anxiety about the procedure was compounded by growing unease about Ethan and Vivian's behavior. They had been suspiciously accommodating about everything, agreeing to all of my requests and expressing none of their usual concerns about the lake house or my other decisions. Their sudden supportiveness felt calculated rather than genuine. Unable to rest, I got up to make tea and overheard Ethan talking quietly on the phone in the living room. The apartment was small enough that voices carried, and I could hear both sides of the conversation clearly. "Tomorrow, while she's under," Ethan was saying. "She'll be out for hours, and then she'll be groggy from the anesthesia for the rest of the day. Are you sure about the power of attorney?" The voice belonged to Vivian, tinny through the phone speaker. "The medical POA gives me broad authority during any period when she's incapacitated," Ethan replied. "Marcus says that's sufficient for this type of emergency sale, especially given her ongoing health problems. What if she fights it afterward? She'll be angry, but she'll get over it. And honestly, without the stress of that place, she might finally start taking better care of herself." I stood frozen in the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the tile floor, listening to my husband and mother-in-law plan to steal my house while I was unconscious on an operating table. The casual tone of their conversation, the assumption that I would eventually accept their betrayal, the complete disregard for my autonomy and wishes made me feel more alone than I had since my grandfather died. The next morning, I went through the motions of preparing for surgery, but everything had changed. As Ethan drove me to the hospital, making small talk about post-surgery care and recovery time, I felt like I was sitting next to a stranger. This man who had promised to love and honor me was planning to rob me while I was at my most vulnerable. The medical team was professional and reassuring, explaining each step of the procedure and answering all of my questions. As they prepared to administer the anesthesia, I made a decision that would prove crucial in the hours to come. Instead of the broad medical power of attorney that Vivian had suggested and Ethan expected, I had asked Arthur to prepare a limited document that specifically restricted any major financial decisions during my incapacitation. When I woke up in the recovery room several hours later, Ethan was sitting beside my bed with an expression I had never seen before. He looked guilty and defiant at the same time, like a child caught doing something wrong but still convinced he was justified. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I was groggy from the anesthesia, but my mind was clear enough to recognize the tension in his posture. "Fine," I managed. "How long was I out?" "About 4 hours for the surgery, then another 2 in recovery." He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "Lily, there's something we need to discuss." Before he could continue, Vivian appeared in the doorway carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing an expression of false sympathy that made my stomach turn. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, approaching the bed with theatrical concern. "You look so pale. How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," I repeated, though I was beginning to feel anything but fine. Vivian set the flowers on the bedside table and took the chair on the other side of my bed. "We have some news that might be upsetting, but we want you to know that everything was handled with your best interests in mind." The room seemed to grow smaller as I waited for her to continue. Part of me wanted to pretend I didn't know what was coming, to maintain the illusion of my marriage for just a little longer. But the larger part of me was ready for the truth, no matter how devastating. "We had to make a difficult decision while you were in surgery," Ethan said quietly. "An opportunity came up that we couldn't pass up." "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, though I already knew. Vivian took my hand in hers, her touch feeling cold and foreign. "A buyer came forward with an exceptional offer for the lake house. With your medical expenses and the ongoing maintenance costs, it seemed like providence." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I had been expecting them. "You sold my house while I was unconscious?" "We sold our house," Ethan corrected. "And we got an amazing price. More than enough to pay off all our debts and set aside money for your ongoing treatment." I stared at him in disbelief. "Our house? That was my inheritance. My grandfather left it to me. And as your husband, I have the legal right to make financial decisions when you're unable to," Ethan replied, his tone becoming defensive. "The power of attorney you signed gives me that authority." Vivian squeezed my hand tighter. "Sweetheart, you'll thank us when you see how much stress this removes from your life. You can focus on getting better without worrying about property maintenance and all those responsibilities." I pulled my hand away from hers and struggled to sit up in the hospital bed. The room was spinning slightly, whether from the anesthesia or the shock of their betrayal, I couldn't tell. "Who bought it?" "A lovely family," Vivian said quickly. "The Millers. They have 2 young children who will enjoy the lake just like you did when you were small." "How much did you sell it for?" Ethan and Vivian exchanged a glance that confirmed my worst suspicions. "That's not important right now," Ethan said. "What matters is that we've secured our financial future." "How much?" I repeated, my voice stronger despite my physical weakness. $800,000, he admitted reluctantly. I closed my eyes, feeling sick. The house had been appraised at over $1.2 million just the year before for insurance purposes. They had sold my inheritance for 2/3 of its value, probably to ensure a quick sale and avoid any chance of me interfering. "You need to rest," Vivian said, standing up and smoothing down her skirt. "We can discuss the details later when you're feeling stronger." After they left, I lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had happened. In the span of a few hours, I had lost the most important thing I owned, discovered that my marriage was built on deception, and learned that I was completely alone in the world. The betrayal was so profound that I felt physically hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of me. But along with the devastation came something else, a cold, clear anger that cut through my grief like a blade. They had stolen from me, lied to me, and manipulated my illness to justify their actions. They had underestimated me, assuming that I would be too weak or too grateful for their protection to fight back. They were wrong. The next morning, as soon as I was discharged from the hospital, I called Arthur Hayes from a taxi on my way home. I explained what had happened and asked him to meet me at his office as soon as possible. Arthur's reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. "They can't do this, Lily," he said firmly after reviewing the limited power of attorney documents. "This POA explicitly restricts major financial decisions. Any sale conducted under this authority would be fraudulent." He leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Your grandfather specifically included protections against this exact scenario. He was worried about fortune hunters and manipulative in-laws. The will includes provisions that would void any coerced sale and impose significant financial penalties on anyone who attempts it." Relief flooded through me for the first time in days. "So the sale isn't valid?" "Not only is it not valid, but your husband and mother-in-law could face serious legal consequences for attempting it. Fraud, elder abuse, financial exploitation of a disabled person." Arthur's smile was predatory. "Your grandfather was a smart man, and he had a very good lawyer. We spent the next hour reviewing my options and developing a strategy. Arthur would immediately file injunctions to stop the sale and begin legal proceedings against Ethan, Vivian, and Marcus Thorne, the real estate agent who had facilitated the fraudulent transaction. He would also contact the Miller family to explain that they were unwitting participants in an illegal sale." "What about Ethan?" I asked as we prepared to leave. "What happens to our marriage?" Arthur's expression softened. That's your decision, Lily. But I will say this. A man who would steal from his sick wife while she's unconscious is not a man worth saving. I went home to find Ethan waiting in our apartment with an expression of nervous determination. He had clearly been rehearsing a speech, probably coached by Vivian, about why I should be grateful for their decisive action and forward-thinking approach to our finances. He never got the chance to deliver it. The sale is fraudulent, I said without preamble as I set my purse down by the door. Arthur is filing injunctions to stop it, and you and your mother are going to face criminal charges for theft and fraud. The color drained from Ethan's face. What are you talking about? I had power of attorney. I had the legal right to make that decision. You have limited medical power of attorney, I corrected. Not financial. The document you signed specifically prohibits major financial decisions during my incapacitation. Any lawyer would have told you that if you had bothered to read it. Ethan stood up from the couch, his hands shaking slightly. You're bluffing. Marcus assured us that the POA was sufficient. Marcus lied to you, just like you lied to me. I felt surprisingly calm despite the magnitude of the confrontation. The sale is void, the money will be returned, and all three of you are going to face the consequences of trying to steal from me. This is insane, Ethan said, his voice rising. I'm your husband. I was trying to help you. You were trying to help yourself, I replied. And you were too greedy and too arrogant to do it legally. The argument that followed revealed the depths of his betrayal and manipulation. He accused me of being ungrateful, unreasonable, and obsessed with the property that was holding us back financially. He claimed that I was too sick to make rational decisions and that he had been protecting me from my own poor judgment. But underneath his justifications, I could see his panic. He had counted on my weakness, my desire to preserve our marriage, and my fear of being alone. He had assumed that I would eventually accept the fait accompli and be grateful for his decisive action. The possibility that I would fight back had never occurred to him. The conversation ended when I asked him to leave. I want you out of the apartment tonight, I said. Take whatever you need for a few days, and we'll arrange for you to get the rest of your things later. You can't throw me out of my own home, he protested. This apartment is in my name, I replied. Just like the house you tried to steal. I can absolutely throw you out, and I am. After Ethan left, I called Chloe and asked her to come over. She arrived within an hour, armed with wine, takeout, and a righteous fury that matched my own. I knew something was wrong, she said as we sat on my couch with containers of Thai food spread between us. The way they both acted around you, like you were incompetent or fragile. It was disgusting. She paused, studying my face carefully. How are you handling all this? Are you okay? It was a complicated question. I felt devastated by the betrayal, furious at the manipulation, and terrified about what came next. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months, free. I think I'm going to be okay, I said slowly. For the first time in a long time, I feel like myself again. Over the next few days, Arthur worked quickly to unravel the fraudulent sale. The injunctions were granted immediately, freezing any transfer of funds or property. Marcus Thorne, the real estate agent, quickly became cooperative when faced with potential criminal charges, providing documentation that showed the extent of the conspiracy. The Miller family, who had believed they were purchasing the property legitimately, were understanding about the situation once Arthur explained what had happened. They agreed to withdraw from the sale without penalty, though they expressed disappointment about losing the house they had already begun to envision as their home. Vivian's reaction to the legal proceedings was predictably dramatic. She called repeatedly, alternating between threats and attempts at manipulation. She accused me of being vindictive and ungrateful, claiming that she had only been trying to help. When I stopped answering her calls, she began showing up at my apartment building, forcing me to involve building security. But it was Ethan's response that hurt the most. Instead of acknowledging his wrongdoing or apologizing for the betrayal, he doubled down on his justifications. He hired his own lawyer and began spreading stories about my mental instability and inability to manage my own affairs. He claimed that I was using my illness to manipulate people and that he had been the victim of my unreasonable demands and emotional manipulation. His campaign to rewrite history might have been effective if not for the documentation Arthur had gathered. The recorded conversations, the fraudulent power of attorney, the rushed sale at below market value, and Marcus Thorne's cooperation all painted a clear picture of premeditated theft. 3 weeks after my surgery, I drove out to the lake house for the first time since the betrayal. I had been afraid that returning to the place that had been the center of so much pain would be too difficult, but I needed to see it for myself. The house stood exactly as I had left it, surrounded by the late autumn colors that had always been my favorite. The lake was calm, reflecting the golden light of the setting sun just as it had during all those evenings I had spent there with my grandfather. Nothing had changed except my understanding of how precious and fragile the things we love can be. I sat on the dock where Grandpa Jenkins had taught me to fish, letting myself cry for the first time since the whole ordeal began. I cried for the marriage I had thought I had, for the trust that had been shattered, and for the grandfather who had tried so hard to protect me from exactly this kind of betrayal. But I also cried with relief that his protections had worked, that his love had reached across death to save the place that meant everything to me. The legal resolution came faster than Arthur had initially predicted. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of serious criminal charges, Ethan and Vivian agreed to a settlement that included full restitution for any costs associated with the attempted sale. An admission of wrongdoing and an agreement to stay away from me and my property. Marcus Thorne lost his real estate license and faced fines that would likely end his career. He had been so confident in the scheme that he had failed to do even basic due diligence on the power of attorney documents, making him legally liable for facilitating the fraud. The divorce proceedings were remarkably straightforward. Ethan had no claim to property I had owned before our marriage, and his attempts to paint me as mentally incompetent were undermined by his own admission that he had tried to steal from me. Our assets were easily divided, and I kept everything that had been mine originally. But the real healing began after the legal matters were resolved. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma, learning to understand how I had allowed myself to become isolated and manipulated. I realized that my desire to be a good wife had made me vulnerable to people who saw my accommodating nature as weakness to be exploited. I also began to rebuild my relationship with my own instincts and judgment. For months, I had been second-guessing myself, seeking approval for decisions that should have been mine alone. Learning to trust myself again was harder than I had expected, but it was also incredibly liberating. Chloe was instrumental in this process, reminding me of who I had been before I allowed Ethan and Vivian to diminish me. "You were never weak," she told me during one of our many conversations about the situation. "You were kind, and they took advantage of that kindness. But kindness isn't the same as weakness, and you proved that when you fought back." 6 months after the betrayal, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to sell the lake house after all, but on my own terms and for my own reasons. The place would always be precious to me, but I realized that I didn't want to live my life looking backward, holding on to the past out of fear of the future. I contacted the Miller family, who were thrilled to learn that the house might be available again. After several conversations, I realized that they would love and appreciate the property in the same way that my grandfather and I had. They weren't looking for a quick profit or a vacation rental investment. They wanted a family home where their children could grow up with the same connection to nature that had shaped my own childhood. We negotiated a sale at fair market value, with the understanding that they would preserve the character of the property and continue the environmental stewardship that my grandfather had practiced. I also established a conservation easement that would protect the land from future development, ensuring that it would remain a haven for wildlife and a peaceful retreat for generations to come. The money from the sale allowed me to buy a smaller house in the city, closer to my work and my friends. It was different from the lake house, but beautiful in its own way, with a garden where I could grow the same wildflowers that had surrounded my grandfather's property. I also used part of the proceeds to establish the Jenkins Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on protecting natural habitats and supporting people recovering from financial elder abuse. It seemed like the perfect way to honor my grandfather's memory while helping others who might face similar betrayals. But perhaps the most important change was in how I approached relationships. I learned to recognize the warning signs of manipulation and control that I had missed or dismissed in my marriage. I practiced setting boundaries and maintaining them, even when it made other people uncomfortable. When I eventually began dating again, I was a different person than I had been when I met Ethan. I was more confident, more aware of my own worth, and less willing to compromise my values for the sake of keeping peace. The men who were attracted to this version of me were fundamentally different from those who had been drawn to my previous accommodating nature. A year and a half after my divorce was finalized, I met David at a gallery opening featuring local environmental artists. He was a wildlife photographer whose work complemented the Foundation's mission, and our initial conversations were about conservation and the importance of preserving natural spaces for future generations. What struck me most about David was how he listened. He asked questions about my work, my interests, and my opinions without trying to steer the conversation toward his own agenda. When I told him about the lake house and why I had ultimately decided to sell it, he understood immediately why the decision had been both difficult and necessary. "It sounds like you found a way to honor your grandfather's legacy while still building your own life," he said thoughtfully. "That takes real courage." Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the intense passion that had characterized my relationship with Ethan. David never tried to change me or manage my decisions, and he supported my work with the Foundation without trying to take credit or control its direction. When I finally introduced him to Chloe, her approval was immediate and wholehearted. "This one actually sees you," she told me after they met. "He's not trying to turn you into someone else or fix problems you don't have." The second anniversary of my betrayal fell on a beautiful spring day. I spent it at the old lake house, which the Miller family had invited me to visit whenever I wanted. Their children were thriving in the environment I had loved so much, building the same connection to nature that had sustained me through so many challenges. As I sat on the dock watching their youngest daughter feed ducks from the shore, I realized that I felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed me from a life that was slowly suffocating me. I had learned to value myself, to trust my instincts, and to build relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. The woman who had been so desperate to save her marriage that she ignored obvious warning signs was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more capable of protecting herself and the things she valued. The journey from victim to survivor to someone who thrived had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every painful step. That evening, as I drove back to the city and the life I had built for myself, I thought about my grandfather and the protections he had put in place to keep me safe. His love had saved me from financial ruin, but more importantly, his example of integrity and self-respect had eventually guided me back to myself. I had learned that the people who truly love us want us to be strong, not weak. They want us to succeed, not to need them desperately. They want to share our lives, not control them. And most importantly, they want us to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include them. The lake house was no longer mine, but the lessons I had learned there would stay with me forever. I had discovered that home isn't a place you can lose to betrayal or manipulation. Home is the strength you carry inside yourself, the boundaries you maintain, and the love you give and receive freely. And that kind of home can never be taken away from you, no matter who tries.